going to yield the floor to Gordon Houlden from the University of Alberta's China Institute. Gordon.
Well, thank you very much, Gary. It's a daunting prospect to follow the Consul General, and I'm going to say a few things about the bilateral relationship and about because I was asked about the Indo-Pacific concept, but I know that Jeff Koharski and you, Gary, have forgotten more about energy in Asia than I know. So that's a challenge. And I know that Dr. Zhang as well on the agricultural side. So I'm really in a difficult position. I'm going to say a few things about all of those things. And then unfortunately, or fortunately, others can correct me. It's a pleasure to be able to address KEI, and thank you for this opportunity. I'd like to say a few things about the prospects for an Indo-Pacific strategy for Canada, which appears likely to be the focus of the next foreign policy update. Indo-Pacific strategy rather than Indo-Asia. The Indian state would probably argue that they are already part of Asia, which is correct. I think that broadly speaking, and this is a shock for many Canadians in my view, because our country is largely had European origins, apart from the indigenous peoples who are here already, of course, and then was powerfully and is powerfully influenced by the United States to our south. The reality is, if you take the long-term view, let's say the last 2 millennia, that's about 4 times the period that Canada has existed, even as a colony, as a colony of Europe. Asia, with 2 great poles of population and economic development, China and India, not to mention others such as Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, etc., has represented the bulk of human development. The rise of Europe and North America overturned this calculus. So if you look at the 18th and 19th and the, let's say, even the first half of the 20th century, that calculus of the economy of the world being dominated by Asia, that was not accurate. But in 2021, Asia now comprises 2/3 of the world's population, and Asia is building steadily towards a similar percentage of global economic output. China alone is about 20%, and you could even dispute what the Consul General said about the size of the Chinese economy. It depends partly on how you count that economy. If you use nominal GDP, Chinese economy is smaller. If you look at purchasing parity, the Chinese economy is larger. But in any case, I would agree with the Consul General, based on current numbers and trend lines, the Chinese economy will be the largest within, let's say, perhaps within this decade. And conceivably, and the former Chinese ambassador to the United States earlier this year in a webinar which I moderated said, look, as China modernizes with 4 times the population of the United States, there's no reason why in the course of this century, China should not have an economy twice the size of the United States, or perhaps even more. That's not automatic, but based on current trend lines, it's also not unrealistic. Politics is also part of the, one could say, political economy, as the Consul General alluded to. And the popularity in some Western states of the concept Indo-Pacific, it's not really new, but it is in vogue now. And I think that's partly because it de-emphasizes China and emphasizes the Indian subcontinent, potentially Southeast Asia, and the trans-Pacific states, United States, and possibly Canada. But if the US had not tilted towards the Indo-Pacific concept, I doubt that we'd be having this conversation. That shift, combined with a loose grouping of 4 states, Australia, India, Japan, the US, has in turn shifted Canadian thinking towards the Indo-Pacific concept, which would comprise economic as well as security dimensions. But I think, and again, this is perhaps reflected in what the Consul General said, although I'm not trying to put words in her mouth, if the bilateral political relationship between Canada and China was not as fraught and difficult as it is now, arguably the most difficult at any time since we established relations in 1970, I also am not sure that we'd be talking as much about the Indo-Pacific concept. But I have a few cautions about Indo-Pacific concept. Number 1, Canada already has privileged access to the Japanese market through TPCPP. Japan actually in itself is 40% of that economic grouping. So we already have that access, as well as a free trade agreement with Korea. A free trade agreement with the heavily protected Indian market would be a very heavy lift. An Indian market is particularly tariff friendly, prone to tariffs, in sectors that are extremely important to us, such as agricultural exports. They are protecting their domestic farmers. And you see that even in the demonstrations, which have recently ended with a capitulation by the Modi government to some of the demands of the farmers. As well, a decade ago, the Indian economy was 1/3 that of China. It is now roughly 1/5. And that's simply because China has achieved steadier growth over the period of that decade. So while India was gaining, and that's partly reflected in its very young population, it's been lagging over the last 10 years, partly because I think it hasn't managed the infrastructure build and the economic openness, trade openness that helped boost Chinese productivity and Chinese growth. We will see, because India with a very young population, China with an aging population like Canada and like most of East Asia, there may be changes in the future ahead. But right for now, let's remember it's 5-1. ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, we have begun a renewed free trade discussions with ASEAN, but a caution here as well. A couple cautions. Number one, in my opinion, and from my experience working abroad, FTAs do not ultimately build trade. Businesses and market forces do so. FTAs can be very useful in providing mechanisms to adjudicate disputes, reducing tariffs. But at the end of the day, I'd put my money on the role of business people on both sides, and the market forces of demand and supply are, to me, the primary drivers of and the energy of business people on both sides in growing trade. An FTA eliminates problems, but it doesn't in itself grow trade. You have to have products that the other side wishes to buy. And the second caution I would have, and the Canadian companies that become more deeply engaged with Southeast Asia and with ASEAN will find that the economies of Asia, right from Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, even Taiwan, are deeply enmeshed in Chinese supply chains. Where is the primary market for Taiwanese exports? The Chinese mainland, Japan, China. And so for ASEAN countries, all but one of them, tiny Brunei, has China as either the number one or the number two market for all the other 9 of those countries, including the larger ones. So you can run to Southeast Asia, but I don't think you can hide from China, because you'll find it there present in the supply chains. Quite frankly, and we saw in 2020 when the Chinese economy grew, albeit very slowly thanks to COVID, while other big economies were shrinking, American capital, both foreign direct investment and portfolio investment, ups significantly the rate of its flow to China, partly because of that growth, but also because American multinational corporations wish to be engaged in Chinese supply chains that both serve China's huge domestic market, and as the Consul General referred to last week, the dual circulation concept, which basically just means China will still continue to depend on export-led development, export-led trade, but will also depend more heavily upon its own internal market, as does, for example, the United States. And then my last caution about putting all our eggs, let's say, into a Indo-Pacific concept would be that China, grosso modo, is roughly equivalent in its economic strength and size to all of East Asia, all of Southeast Asia, and all of South Asia, stopping at the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. So you have, in effect, half of all the Asian economy concentrated in China. So if the Indo-Pacific concept means a renewed effort to diversify the Canadian economy, which is hyper-dependent on the US market, I'm all in favor. That's a very welcome thing. China does not look at just one part of the global economy. China is active in every part of the global economy with tiny exceptions. So yes, for sure, Indo-Pacific, I'm skeptical that it can be done or should be done at the expense of attention to that burgeoning China market. Let's look for growth wherever we can find it. But back to the politics, keeping an eye on time. And I'd ask you, Gary, when I get a couple of minutes out, just give me a quick warning, and I'll because I could go on far too long. Public opinion polls, which the Consul General referred to, Don't just talk about 14%. Only 14% have a positive view of China. That's almost getting down to a rounding error. But they also support Canada distancing itself from China, including in trade. But that flies in face of the buoyant Chinese economy and the sustained demand for our goods, which in 2020, in the midst of COVID, grew by over 8.5%, and are growing still in 2021, while all of our um, large market, particularly the United States, other large economies, our exports declined. And that's from a small base. We have to remember that only 4.8% of our exports go to China versus 75% in the US. That makes the case right there for diversification. If that base were larger, we would be doing better. Export services to China declined sharply in 2020. And here's part of the hidden story. If you look at the goods trade with China, you find that we run about a 3-to-1 deficit to China. We buy 3 times as much as we sell. If you add in services, where we do much better proportionally than China, that lowers the imbalance somewhat. It's still large, but it lowers somewhat. But what are the two largest components of the service exports? Chinese tourists and Chinese students. Chinese tourists were coming in the hundreds of thousands, and I think that market had just been scratched. They came mostly to British Columbia, the eastern slopes of the Rockies, some to Ontario, but you'll find pockets that are interested in exotic travel, the Arctic. A few Canadians have been there. I know many Chinese who have, curiously, and also Chinese students. Now, we're not doing quite as badly on the students. Some stayed here despite COVID, some studied remotely, and they are trickling back, but they're not going to be at that number of 200,000 or more than 200,000 that we saw pre-COVID. And we have to hope that these shift in patterns don't become permanent. And that's another of the many reasons I have for wanting to see the end of this wretched COVID epidemic. However, back to the politics. Pressure on Canada from Washington to harmonize our Chinese policies with those of Washington are significant. That was the case under President Trump, and it's still the case under President Biden. Of course, for Canadians, it's complicated. The United States is not just our largest trading partner, it's also our security guarantor. Ottawa cannot afford, whoever is a party in power, to ignore views out of the United States. Paradoxically, however, and this is a personal view, a US superpower that is in relative decline vis-a-vis China. I'm not saying that US disappears. Europe's not going to disappear. The EU, China isn't, and US isn't. We're going to have a multipolar world. But a superpower that's in relative decline and is not as powerful in relative terms may be stricter in terms of opposing deviation from US-China policy than was the case in a unipolar world post the Cold War, when America had no rivals whatsoever and could be felt it could be rather generous with the views of wayward allies. We saw that U.S. pressure in the inclusion of a clause in our free trade pact with U.S. and Mexico, included last year, which has a clause in there specifically targets non-market economies. It says basically if any one of the three concludes a free trade agreement with a non-free market economy, you can just hold that page up to light and it says China. The other two parties have the right to depart. Now, that's not likely, as the Consul General noted, but I'd like to think that an FTA is not off the table indefinitely, but free trade agreements, even the US free trade agreement, I recall, was highly controversial in Canada. It touches on sovereignty, etc. You need a lot of public support and political support to do that. An FTA with China is off the table for the time being. Let's put it in the back burner. At a time appropriate, we might be able to bring it back. And to look a little bit further again now into energy, and here again, I'm going to be really short with Jeff and Gary there. I'm going to be quickly corrected. But 83% of global energy usage comes from fossil fuels. China is not abandoning fossil fuels at an extraordinary rate. In fact, usage of fossil fuels in some instances has increased. That flies in the face of Chinese goals. I think my general experience of China has been if you question their ability to meet a goal, you often have to correct yourself within a few years. I'm speaking now about the very near term. But with a a shortage of energy, and with a growing economy, China's found that, as in effect experienced an energy shock. Chinese Premier said just in October, Li Keqiang, that the energy transition must be sound and well paced. That to me, I take as a code word for um, not so fast that it damages the fundamental Chinese economy. And quite frankly, China is hardly the only country in the world that has to pace itself in climate change work against the overall economic performance. Publics will not have it otherwise. Um, China has one great advantage. Unlike many economies, it has the means to fund energy transition, whereas many states have ambitious goals but lack the means to achieve them. And so I have some confidence China will do so. And of course, I could go on at great length. If you travel in Xinjiang, you can go for 100 kilometers where you may have almost uninterrupted views of wind turbines, solar power, nuclear power. China is building is in the process of building or planning some 60 nuclear reactors. All of those elements are growing and developing. However, it takes time. And coal is still king in China, and that can't be undone overnight. China, in theory, has a lot of shale gas. In theory, more in theory than the United States, but it's hard to get at. It's deep in the ground. There's not enough water. A lot of people live on top, say in Sichuan province. And so that's not going to be a quick fix. China is going to be a major market for LNG, and I'll leave others to comment on that. China has cut back on funding coal plants abroad, and I think that's a good thing, given that coal is the number one target of the climate change movement, as we saw in COP26 last month. However, in 2020, China built 3 times as much coal-fired capacity as the rest of the world combined, roughly still a rough coal plant a week. Having said that, China has learned, and quite frankly, Canada helped China learn through a couple things. One was a very successful project under CETA of clean coal technology, and also a program between Tsinghua University and the University of Alberta, same topic, clean coal. I'm not suggesting that clean coal is without its downsides, but it is sure an awful lot better than these aged and much less efficient companies.
I've only got one question for you.
Shoot.
And there's many that I could ask, but
Yep.
This question, since you touched upon the issue of COP26, and that is that Canada has made commitments to being net zero by 2050. Who will hold Canada accountable to that? NGOs, capital markets, voters themselves, activist shareholders. What are the levers that you perceive will, because China's also made a commitment to net zero by 2060, what are the levers that will compel China to live up to the ambitions that you believe that they're going to try and achieve?
Oh, it's a good question, and I'm not brimming with confidence. Give a look at Canada's own track record on climate change goals and our inability to meet them. So this is not the pot calling the kettle black. In case of Canada, it'll have to be broad-based public support. One of the strengths of our system, if you have broad-based public support, I think a lot can get done. But marshaling that with 10 provinces, 3 territories, and a federal government, very hard to do. And when you make those goals too ambitious, we fail them steadily. Canadians want climate change policies unless it hits in the pocketbook, and there is a real problem for the political class, of which you know better than I. In the case of China, I hope to be around in 2060 to check whether or not President Xi Jinping's promises will come true. I'm not confident of that, however, so I'll look to the youngest person on today's call to check that box. I think maybe Zhang Jian, you maybe have a chance to make that date. In any case, it's not easy in China's case either, and we saw that a little bit of slipping back this year. Chinese are not as different from us as some people would make out. We're all human beings. We have the same general drivers. We want a prosperous populace. We want to be popular internationally. We want to do the right thing for the environment. And China is very vulnerable in terms of climate change if they don't get it right. A lot of people, most of the people living on the coast and a very water deficient north and west. And with a central planning system, it should be doable, but it's a massive economic machine that runs in very deep ruts, and coal is king, And it's to undo all that is a massive project. And it's not just, I know it sounds simple. Central government controls everything and an order goes out. But long ago, the Chinese had a saying, the heaven is high and the emperor is far away. It just means the central government, they can send out a signal, but I have sympathy for them. They have got tens of thousands of municipalities and hundreds of thousands of enterprises. To get them all to dance to the same tune is no more easy than it is for us with our 13 provinces. So I'd say I'm semi-confident that both countries will meet the goal, and I hope that both do, but I wouldn't bet my life on either one. Let's just be hopeful. Thank you.
All right.